Awesome, guys. Well, I'm excited because accounting is the most fun thing we could talk about of all the topics in the world. I'm just kidding. I can see the look on your guys' faces. We're gonna just briefly kind of go through some things I've learned in the years of nonprofit accounting. Kind of share with you some key pitfalls. Sounds like there were some people who were involved in some nonprofits, maybe have friends. So I'm going to share that information with you. I hope it helps, may help you in your business as well. Just some of these key things that I've learned. I'm going to go ahead and share. Hopefully, let's go. Sorry, I want to make sure I share the right thing here. Everybody see this okay?
Yes. It's not in presentation mode, but we can see it.
There we go. Okay, perfect. All right. So a little bit of a background about me. I actually started in accounting, several years ago. It's been a long time, but I cut my teeth originally doing nonprofit audits. So I was every nonprofit person's favorite person to show up every year. And they were, and so I definitely have seen some of the headaches that people experience when running nonprofits. I think it's been probably 3 years since I've been involved in nonprofit audits, but I'll kind of share with you some of these key things when it comes to a nonprofit. So as far as kind of when it comes to accounting generally for a nonprofit, you're going to follow the same general accounting method that you do as a for-profit, especially if you're kind of just starting your nonprofit. So that means you're going to look at your cash versus accrual. A lot of people have questions on this. The easiest way to kind of understand for a lot of you who apply for grants as a nonprofit, when you go to sign the contract, this will kind of help you understand the difference between cash and accrual. So when you sign the contract for a grant, you receive those donor funds, if you will, whether it's state or federal. If you're on a cash basis in accounting, you would recognize the donation that you got money-wise when it actually hits your bank account. And that's very similar with a for-profit company. For-profit company, let's say you sign a new client, you sign a contract, let's say it's a year agreement, they pay up front, it's $15,000. You're not going to really record that until it hits your bank account on a cash accounting method. Versus accrual, you would actually account for it in your accounting when you sign the contract. So you still haven't received the money yet, but you sign the contract, you're now underneath contract to receive those funds, you'd recognize it in accrual method. We're not going to go over the journal entries. That stuff's too boring. But if anyone wants to sit down and talk about how to account for all that, I will take my time. I will give you good resources and help you do that. That's not a problem. As far as recognizing contributions, that's all kind of the same. I kind of tied those two together right there. 3 common challenges that I see people struggle with when it comes to working in a nonprofit is tracking the use of funds. Oftentimes when you get a grant or money, you're going to be in some cases required to track that. And a lot of people try to just track it on paper. And depending on how big the donation is and who's all involved, that's not going to cut it. Especially if you're required to do an audit, you're actually going to be required to use some sort of real accounting software like QuickBooks. And depending on how big you are, there's tons of other softwares out there that help with accounting. But this is the biggest pitfall I see people get into is they'll get the grant money and the grant money says, hey, you need to account for receiving it and then where all the money goes, all your expenses, and all the things that you do to benefit people. So I have a good friend who runs a mental health kind of awareness company, and it's kind of structured in some ways as a nonprofit, but whenever they receive money, especially if it's grant or things along those lines, oftentimes they're required to track that money and who it benefits. And if you don't do that and you're required to get an audit, you could lose your funding if you don't track that. So QuickBooks getting into class tracking transactions is a big deal and super helpful for even if you're for profit. If you have different departments and divisions, being able to break out your revenue and your expenses is also super helpful. So that's what I recommend. QuickBooks has that tool, makes it actually pretty easy, even in the online or desktop version. So that's just some quick info for you guys. Budgeting. This is it's number 2 on the list, but it is a huge pitfall for any company. Doesn't matter if you're for profit, nonprofit. If you run out of money, especially as a nonprofit, before you're set to get more donations and you have people on payroll, I see a lot of nonprofits end up shutting down, especially in their early stages, because they don't allocate, they don't plan and budget for 12 months, and then they don't track where they're at. So that's a big deal when it comes to nonprofit and tracking where you're at, especially if you go long wins of time before you get more funding, more donor money. I would say adhering to the grant or donor agreement. Oftentimes I've had to go look at a contract back when I was auditing between a donor and the recipient of the money. And there were specific requirements, like money held in a reserve account. And it was supposed to be like X amount of dollars, and people didn't do that. And then they end up losing their funding because they didn't actually, they read the donor agreement at the time. They remember, oh yeah, I need to just set aside $25,000, but all of a sudden, comes year end, they've exhausted all the money, they didn't keep the reserve account. They're either getting an audit, or the donor comes in and wants to see, hey, where's your reserve account money? And they didn't have it. So the donor pulls the money. So always pay attention to those donor agreements. They're super important. Grant money, the same. That's usually where all the kind of like the stipulations are going to show up. The big mistakes, some of these tie with what we just talked about, taking money without reading the fine print. That's huge. Make sure you understand the requirements whenever you're taking people's money. Not following the management/operating agreement. Whenever you establish your nonprofit and even your company, this is huge for for-profit entities as well. I see this all the time. This is a huge pitfall. They don't establish a strong management or operating agreement. And how that works is you're establishing who has responsibilities. For a for-profit, it's going to establish ownership and things of that nature. But in a nonprofit, it also kind of begins to tell you, okay, who's responsible for this? What are their powers? And if nonprofits don't adhere to that, and let's say they get an audit from the IRS, the IRS calls into question, hey, and they can be audited by the IRS. They're saying, hey, look, you aren't following the purpose that you set out to as a nonprofit, and you're not adhering to the operating agreement you created. And usually to get some type of nonprofit status, a true nonprofit, you have to go through a long approval process. And if they come in and find out you're not adhering to those rules, you can lose the nonprofit status and end up in a ton more trouble than just simply losing your nonprofit. They could potentially come after you. And the last is not asking for help. Look, when I was an auditor, if someone had called me outside the audit and said, hey, I have some questions, would love to sit down and pick your brain on what to do, I would totally give my time to sit down and be like, okay, here's your questions. Okay, let's talk solutions. And I think that's the same thing for anybody that's a business owner. Oftentimes we're scared to call our friends or our accountants. Sometimes you need to pay. There's time for that. But I would tell you that there's a lot of good out there, especially in the atmosphere here in Utah. I've seen a lot of accountants over the years share a lot of free knowledge with their clients to help their clients, whether they're nonprofit, whether they're for-profit. So always don't be afraid to ask for help. They'll let you know the line if you cross it, and you can tell them up front, just let me know the line when I need to pay for this. And if you're upfront about it, they'll probably donate even more time to help you, especially if you kind of show that willingness to be like, hey, I understand that everyone needs to be paid. These are some great resources. Nonprofit accounting, again, it's not the most greatest thing in the world. It's not tech. It's not some type of new technology that we're talking here that's going to change the way the world works. But if you ever need a good resource, nonprofit accounting basics.org, there's tons of great information there. They even boil it down to how to like do the journal entries in accounting, which I think is huge. And then the last piece, understand internal control. Whether you're a for-profit or a nonprofit, internal controls and having like check approval processes and not having one CFO that literally can write and sign all the checks is super important to whoever you are. So always create a counterbalance. This kind of goes over some of those basic ways to create counterbalances. So if you're in a position where your company is kind of grown and you have finance people involved, take some time. And I just encourage you, and I see abuse in this all the time. go through and kind of just perform a little review and be like, okay, what in here do we need to create a counterbalance for? I don't want someone having access to my bank account, the ability to write checks, the ability to sign them and send them out the door. Because they could write checks themselves. They could spin up another LLC and pretend it was doing lawn maintenance and cut $2,000 checks, once a month, and eventually funnel out 24K, out of your nonprofit or your for-profit. I see it all the time. So if you're in that position as a business owner, take the time, review it. If you're not, file this in the back of your head. It's a huge piece, but that's really, we want to keep it around 10 to 12 minutes. So I want to keep it short and sweet. What questions do people have as it pertains to nonprofit or even a for-profit? And we'll just kind of dive through those questions with whatever time we have left.
Taylor, do you have any common examples of things that need controls? So like you said, the same person who writes a check shouldn't be the person who reviews it. Are there other similar ones?
Yeah, so I would say that's a big obvious one that I see a lot. Bank access is a simple one. Control who can do what in the bank account. A lot of people just give access to a bank account, and everything revolves around money in my world. So that's a big thing. When I'd go in and audit, I used to audit a ton of public housing. So if you have like Salt Lake City Public Housing Authority, I didn't do their audit, but I did other audits for other groups similar. We'd go in and we'd have to review, and because they were kind of dealing with low income housing, right? We wanted to actually go in and do a review and make sure that everyone who was renting was a real person. And we ran into instances, not me personally, but people adjacent from me at the firm would run into instances where we'd go do an inspection, person wasn't real. And people at the nonprofit, now, again, this wasn't always in a public housing scenario, but these are companies that would take government money, because the government will donate to nonprofits who deal with low income housing. And these people we would see occasional fraud where they would literally be pocketing the money, pretending to be someone. And a lot of those issues came into, and the reason why I use this was the application, the approval was all the same person. So when a low income person would submit an application, it would go to one person at the nonprofit. That person would review it, approve it, and they had all access to all pieces of the process. And so they were able to kind of spin up fictitious individuals, and the government would donate money to pay rent in their behalf, and then the individual would be able to siphon it out. So there's elements of this that I see all the time. That's a good example. That could go for any company. For a for-profit tech, places where I see abuse is typically in marketing and sales. I will see people submitting for major, for expenses that technically aren't tied to the business. And when things are growing real fast in tech and running loose, it's easy to oversee that. Divvy is a powerful product that I highly, I like Divvy personally, but that's a good example of a tool that helps negate that. And so if you're growing really fast in tech, I've had clients in the past that literally are 10xing year over year for 3-4 years straight. And that's crazy growth, right? So their sales team goes from 1 to 50 in almost like 3 years. Having a good control over their spending accounts and their ability to submit for reimbursement is super important.
Taylor, I have a question.
Yeah.
As far as raising money goes, we've talked of doing a nonprofit here in Carbon County to kind of employ coal miners, help transition from coal to tech, which could be like helping global warming as well. And so the question come up as far as a lot of grant people go for funding from like EDA and some of the government organizations.
Yeah.
But I've heard that there's organizations out there that have budgets for like global warming or helping coal communities or stuff like that. How do you, your difference between government versus private, is it, any comments there on how to go after the private stuff?
Yeah, it is a big difference. There's a big difference with government. There's a crazy ton of red tape for several reasons. There's also still incredible abuse, especially as new programs roll out, as we've seen in the last, couple of years with COVID. There's been a lot of great programs rolled out. As an accountant, I'm just telling you what I see. I do see substantial abuse occasionally. Not everyone, but you definitely see it. So how does that tie into my question or my answer to you? You really got to find, and I would be happy. I have a deep CPA connection base. I would send a blast message to everyone on LinkedIn. We're all good friends. They wouldn't be offended, or email and see if anybody knows of these groups and help you source. And the reason why they're great is because oftentimes these donors are their clients. And then they can reach out to the client and say, hey, this is up here. And they all know me well enough. They're okay to give a referral. Which is always the hardest thing with accountants. They never refer anything. If anybody's ever tried to get a referral out of an accountant. But I would be happy to help that way. I have a lot of other people that are in nonprofit that we can ask around. Really, I don't have a straight answer as to a group or a source. It is different. It's a lot easier, in my opinion, to get private than it is to go federal, depending on the program to some degree. I think you definitely could attract a lot of money from donors you never even thought about. I think Dev Mountain would be, these type of groups would potentially be interested in partnering. And sometimes you have to bring it to their attention, and then they will lend to you as a nonprofit. So sometimes they don't even have a fund in place for this kind of stuff, but you bring it to the attention of the right people. They're like, yeah, we'll allocate some money to help subsidize that. I see that.
So kind of a backup question, what do you see kind of the biggest buckets that private firms do have funds for? Is it, drug addiction? Is it coal? Not coal. I mean, is it global warming? Is it helping kids?
Mental health is growing incredibly fast. As far as if I could tell you what the biggest buckets are, I don't know what the biggest buckets are, to be honest. The only way you kind of really, and I haven't researched it, you probably get out and research it, but it's typically private held information. And unless they're a publicly traded company, to get access to that type of information is hard. So we'd almost have to look at public companies where their financials are disclosed openly, right? And then you could kind of identify your buckets that way, but I don't know, sorry. But I'd look for you. So Spencer, if you hit me up on LinkedIn and drop that as a message, I will tag that and put it as a to-do, and give me a week. I'll get back to you.
Okay, thanks, Taylor.
Anybody else?
One question I had for you, Taylor, was just going through the, I think it was 3 or 4 boxes that you had on a previous slide. Are there, kind of similar to what Karthik was asking, do you have any type of tools or templates or frameworks, checklists that you go through to do some sort of gap analysis on kind of the state of the company and where it falls in each one of those topics that you talked about? Or how would you propose companies do a gap analysis to see where they should prioritize their efforts on these items?
So if it's a nonprofit, for example, we'll start with that, and then I'll jump into for-profits. When it's a nonprofit, this non-countingbasics.org has fantastic information on how a nonprofit should be set up, and that helps you. It's not I think they have some free resources too, but that helps you understand, especially in this bottom line internal control, beginning to analyze where your gaps are. And so I don't have a tool that will quickly just summarize everything for nonprofits specifically. As for profits, I've done significant amounts of consulting over the years, and most of it has been not significant, but I've done a decent amount of consulting. And whenever I go in and do a gap analysis, I kind of know, unfortunately, and I'd be actually willing to potentially put something to Excel and kind of try to help build a tool that everyone could use, but I don't have anything specific. It's usually just my knowledge. There are tools out there, but usually they want you to pay. To get a free resource is hard. One of the greatest tools I use, I'd be willing to share, is I have this very comprehensive cash flow tool. It's very complex. You have to be kind of savvy with Excel. It does feed across like 7 or 8 different spreadsheets, but it analyzes your expenses, revenues, helps you forecast up to 5 years. A lot of people who build forecasts, they're kind of put into this little box where they try to just do it very quickly. But oftentimes, especially if you're in a startup stage, which we see a lot of people who join here kind of are in that early stage, investors kind of like to tear that apart. And so sometimes getting something that's a little bit more granular can be super beneficial. I'd be willing to share that. But as far as in particular gap analysis tool, I don't have anything specific. Sorry.
No, those are helpful resources. I was just taking some notes. I think that's helpful to just understand to get directed by you. I would imagine that people would love to, there are at least some of us that would love to get the template that you're talking about. So however you're willing to share that with the group, I'd be happy to send it out, but otherwise, whatever is best and easiest for you to share that would be great.
Totally. So what I'll do is I'll get that over to you, Taylor. It's pretty, I don't think it's too big of a file to email. If it is, we can get it up on Google. I'll share it out of my private drive, not a big deal. And anyone with access can just download it. So there's a couple different ways we can do that. It is really designed to be used in Excel versus Google Sheets, although it does kind of translate. You just have to kind of check things because it is one of those complex tools where it all feeds off each other. But I'll give that to you. I'll go find a couple other gap analysis tools that I think are very useful, and I will share that with you as well. So I'll put that down as a to-do item. What else?
Taylor, I got a question. For the very basic startup, which is exactly what I am right now, I'm looking at forecasting whenever the major funding does come in at around $5 million. Once the due diligence comes in from the funding organization, then I can bring in a CFO to do that. But in the meantime, the budget is very short. So I think to get rid of all the BS, have you ever worked with someone then as a consultant to set up with a firm, let's say offshore, whether it's the Philippines or in India, where it's a trusted group that you have come to know, and you can recommend somebody who is on this little bitty budget?
Have I used anyone specifically? Are you kind of looking for someone who's kind of an outsourced finance that's overseas that could help you with this at kind of a reduced rate?
Just to be able to take the numbers of the expenditures that are going out from the funding, as you talked about, and you've got to be able to show all those different areas, categories, et cetera, et cetera.
Yep.
I'm wearing multiple hats right now. And, it's just me and my chief technology officer and a whole bunch of attorneys. So this kind of stuff is just driving me up, a wall between marketing and sales and customer service and now, and accounting. So I'm just, yeah.
Well, it's a great question. So do I have anyone overseas that I think is completely competent at that?
Yeah.
The answer right now is no.
Okay.
I've never used anyone overseas on a finance level that has kind of just, shown me that they could do what you probably need. And even at a simple level, I'll tell you this, Alan, if you send me over kind of, hit me up on LinkedIn, I'll drop it. I need to drop it here in a sec. I'll drop my LinkedIn profile. I think we already may be connected, but
yep.
If you send me a message on LinkedIn, I will take seriously an hour of my time and I'll sit down and maybe we can talk more one-on-one and I can help you come up with some ideas and maybe even help you just at least begin to build it, coach you on doing it yourself. And like you said, your time's taken. So if that would be helpful to you, I'm happy to help at that level. I don't charge for any of that. It's just, we're all friends here.
I appreciate it.
Yeah.
I love that there's a Midday Connect friendship group. That makes my heart warm. Any other questions for Taylor? Since we have his attention right now. Otherwise, Taylor, if you don't mind throwing your LinkedIn into the chat or the best way for people to connect with you. This has been great. I know it's kind of a bite-sized education in a short amount of time, but I think it does introduce topics to us that are helpful for us to think about. And then also these resources are fantastic. So any other questions before we close up shop for today?
Can I do a plug for Taylor?
You can handle. We're all friends here, Karthik, remember?
So one of the things that Taylor taught me that he could do is that he helps you figure out how you can get R&D credits for the work that your startup is doing. And it doesn't just apply to bio startups. So even I can imagine someone like Spencer, right? You probably can get some R&D credits, tax credits, and reduce your taxes. So just a plug for Taylor and what he does and what I would find useful when I actually start earning money.
Awesome. Thanks, Karthik. That's great. Well, I think, let's see. I see. Thanks, Taylor, for putting your LinkedIn there in the chat. I would suggest everybody connect with Taylor. He's fantastic. And just as an announcement for next week, we're going to have Chad Jardine, who's on the call right now, talk to us a little bit about marketing. With his experience, I think he's got 20, 25 plus years experience in that space. I'm throwing out numbers, Chad, so you can correct me where I'm wrong, but super excited to have him go through an actual case study of what some of the things he's been working on over the last little while that I think will be applicable to the group. So that'll be next week, next Tuesday. But in the meantime, hope everybody's doing well. Go ahead.
Thanks for the plug, Taylor. I was fat fingering my keyboard trying to get my audio back on, and I was Zoom challenged. But hopefully, it'll be much better next week. I'll be practicing between now and then, and we'll be in top form.
Awesome. Well, thanks, Chad. We'll be sending out the topic as we typically do. But yeah, thanks for all of your time. Look forward to seeing you next week, and have a great week, all. We'll see you later.